I'm Ian Shapiro, and I have the great privilege of introducing Doug for the third of his Stimson lectures on capitalism, knowledge drives wealth. Just before I say a few words about Doug, just to let everybody know that at the close of today's proceedings, there will be a reception on the second floor to which everybody is invited. So I thought I would tell you two things about Doug. One more generally about him, and the other more specifically relevant to today's and yesterday's and the day before lectures. So there are many remarkable things about Doug, but I think in some ways the most remarkable thing about him is the number of times he has reinvented himself. Most academics sort of find a recipe that works and they are successful and, you know, relatively Pavlovian thereafter. They just keep pecking away at, at the same thing, and they get, as Doug said, for the next 50 years, they get fed. So that's not Doug. Doug started his career writing a first book which actually established almost an entire field. This Political Consequences of Electoral Laws book was a field, it's certainly a field redefining book. Others had worked on this, but he for decades, that was the standard reference. And he got bored with that general topic. And it was in the late 50s, early 1960s, the public choice movement had come along. And Doug produced a number of very important papers in the early public choice literature on majority rule, on measures of party fragmentation, some with other scholars, but a number by himself. And he was thought to be a rising star in the emerging field of public choice in the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, John Rawls published his theory of justice, and Doug developed interest in normative questions, or explicitly normative questions. I think all of his work has implicitly been normative. And he wrote some very important papers on distribution that have stood the test of time as well, extremely well. And then when I came along here in the 1970s, he was working on the subject of equality, eventually published a book with a number of younger colleagues and graduate students called Equalities, which to this day remains the best analytical treatment of the subject of equality. And then he got bored with all that, and what Stephen didn't tell you on Tuesday, it wasn't just that John Daniels called him up to be chief administrator of the city, which he did, but before that, Doug took a leave and actually ran the Daniels campaign for mayor against the Italian-dominated machine and won. And when he came back to Yale after his 2 years in the city, he went to SOM, and he decided to study public management from the point of view of somebody with all of that behind him that I've just described, and as a practitioner. And not content with that, he spent the next close to decade writing a monumental book called City, Urbanism and Its End, which is widely recognized in the literature on urban politics as one of the best books, but also harkens back to old debates in political science started by Bob Dahl's Who Governs in 1956. There had been a series of books about power, catalyzed by that book, all of which were based on studies of New Haven. And so Doug came back to that power literature with City, and I think made some very important contributions to that. So he is, and now he's been working for the last several years on this book about capitalism. He has more than 200,000 words already written. I've seen some chapters on knowledge, and it's again completely different from anything he's done before. But perfectionist that he is, he will sandpaper and polish and plane away until he has a definitive statement to make on this subject, which I have absolutely no doubt he will. So that's Doug, incredibly unusual, creative person, made definitive contributions to so many different fields of political science. Then the specific thing I wanted to say that's relevant to this series of lectures that he's giving now is that in 1975, he published a very important paper in the American Political Science Review called The Limits of Consensual Decision. And this paper was a critique of Buchanan and Tulloch's book, the
Calculus of Consent.
The Calculus of Consent, for which Buchanan was eventually awarded a Nobel Prize in 1986. But they didn't give it to Tulloch, even though they had written it together. But in those days, it was unthinkable to give a Nobel Prize to a political scientist, even though they have since given one to Elinor Ostrom. Nonetheless, Tulloch was not happy about that. But Doug's paper, the Calculus of Consent, the thesis of the book was that we should set up constitutional systems to bias the world toward the status quo, particularly because if people have rights that they think are very important to them, it should be difficult to change them. And so it was widely seen as a kind of subtext of it as a defense of the American system that Doug has been criticizing in these lectures. But in that paper, in that 1975 paper, Doug introduced the concept of utility drift. Utility drift, and by what he meant by utility drift is the following, that if you set up a system to bias things toward the status quo, it sounds like it's something fixed, but actually it's not fixed. The status quo can drift, and the utilities that different people derive from the status quo can change over time. And so if you think about making it very hard to change things, you might be making it very hard to change some new status quo to which the world has drifted since you put into place your institutional system to make it hard to change the status quo. And so think of a couple of the examples Doug gave in the last lecture. One was gun control. Well, when the Federalist Papers were being written to get the Constitution adopted in New York and Virginia, they had to make a promise that there would be a Bill of Rights. And otherwise, it was a condition for getting the Constitution adopted. And the wide expectation was that the Bill of Rights would protect states' rights. But Madison, very concerned about a resurgence of the anti-federalists' power, said no, and he rewrote the Bill of Rights as individual rights, not as states' rights. And of course, when he was writing about individual rights, the guns, we had muskets. But the utility drift has been such that now we have, people say 350 million guns in America. Paolo Zanoni, who's here somewhere today, reckons it's more like 900, right?
Oh, 900.
Okay, all right. So this is not the world that Madison was remotely contemplating when he created an individual right to bear arms protected by the Second Amendment. The other obvious one is environmental regulation, which Doug mentioned, where again, there's been massive utility drift in the status quo that our institutions are now, as Doug pointed out, straining at the margins to address. So this is just one example of how Doug's work over the years gives us so many insights into the sorts of things that he's talking about today. I'm usually a critic of long introductions, but it seemed to me sufficiently warranted in this case. But now I will sit down and shut up and turn it over to Doug. Welcome.
Thanks, Ian. 3 of my children are here, and I hope they believe all, or at least some of the wonderful things you said. All right. This is what I hope to do today, and it's mostly to celebrate capitalism as an adventure in learning about what works, what doesn't, what people can be expected to pay for, what they can't, what defeats disease, what doesn't, what keeps a house warm at night at low cost, what doesn't. So it's an accumulation of knowledge, and every new firm is a kind of live experiment. Most fail, and a few succeed spectacularly. This is the list. I don't know really why I put it up in such detail, but it begins with small firms working on precision metal tools, and a particular kind of tools called machine tools, which are tools for making machines. They are tools, in a sense, for making tools. And the best known instance is the lathe, which we'll see an example of here in a minute. The concepts of accuracy and precision are both in play here, and they don't mean the same thing at all. This diagram from Simon Winchester shows think of these as bullets being aimed at the middle of the target. In the left-hand circle, the bullets are tightly clustered and in the right place. There is accuracy and precision. Being in the right place is accuracy. Precision is having a story and sticking to it. The example in the middle is precise but inaccurate, and the one on the right is imprecise. And if you're truly imprecise, accuracy doesn't even have a clear meaning. Precision comes to mean both precision and accuracy, and it gets defined by a tolerance. When you make something, you guarantee, let's say you say it's going to be 1 inch in diameter. It could be up to 1.001 inches or 0.999 inches, but it's got to be in that narrow range. And those tolerances, as the foundation of an industrial economy occurs, those tolerances get thinner and thinner. More zeros, 0.0006 or 7 zeros, 1, would be a tolerance on fine machinery for a watch or an aircraft engine. Another pair of concepts have to do with reliability and availability. Availability means constructing, say, a factory in such a way that the tool needed for a given operation will be available when it's needed and won't be in the way when it isn't needed. And reliability means that it will function many, many times without fail. You all know what reliability means. It means working correctly many, many times in a row, as illustrated by this fine machine right here. This gantry crane is used all over the world. Every harbor which has any freight traffic will have many gantry cranes, and they have a certain reliability. A pretty good reliability would be 100,000 straight operations on average without a failure. An even better would be 500,000 or 1 million. And the progression in machine tools, which stand behind tools we use directly, has made possible higher and higher degrees of reliability. Not always achieved, as on the right, and sometimes catastrophically not achieved. Reliability is an economic question, but not just an economic question. Everyone in this room has repeatedly bet her life on the reliability of Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines and Boeing 737 flying systems. So those are background concepts, and now let's look at real people and real firms who made extraordinary contributions without ever being famous in the sense of movies or newspapers. The steam engine, the first steam engine, well, the very first steam engine was around 60 AD. A man named Hero of Alexandria created a spinning, think of a donut, a metal donut filled with water and heated from below with nozzles that sprayed steam out. So you heat this thing and the steam makes it spin at a very high speed. And the ancients they never thought of using it to do work, but they thought it was very fun to look at, and I'm sure it was. The first modern steam engine was the new common engine, 1712. The Boulton and Watt improvement of that engine came in the 1780s, and modern high pressure steam engines first emerged in the year 1800. The steam engine drove the machine tool industry because it created an enormous market for precisely designed and highly reliable machinery, which could be driven by steam power. Henry Maudsley, it's spelled Maudsley, but I'm told by people who speak the King's English as opposed to our English that Maudsley spells Maudsley as if it were an E. This guy was quite remarkable, no formal education, went to work as a powder monkey at age 12, grew to be 6'2" and a fine specimen of a man, had a long career designing machinery and hiring and firing the best young people in Great Britain to help in that task. His direct contributions, there were actually half a dozen, but the one that was most important was the ability to manufacture machine screws so that they were precisely alike, one after another, thousands at a time. What do I expect you to do about those? I have some theory about how those are pertinent to this, but the thing about them is that they are precisely the same. The motion of the lathe is doing two things at once. It's rotating this way, and the cutting point is moving this way, so that as the cutting point moves and the lathe turns and moves, the object being worked, it cuts a kind of barber pole pattern on the metal, and that you can change the pitch of that barber pole cut to make any particular kind of screw, and then you can repeat it. Once you automate it in the machine, you can have the machinery repeat it thousands, indeed millions of times over and over again. And the cheap bolts, which I bought a few weeks ago at Lowe's, they're actually made by a different process, but they were made possible by Maudsley's invention. There's a machine that's working. One of the interesting things about early capitalism is that the customer of first resort was often the government. In Britain, it was the Royal Navy. And the product, a ship of the line like this one, would require what we call pulleys, and they call blocks. They're wooden objects, and they were maybe about like that, like the one pictured beneath the bird on the right. And they had to be precisely alike and replicable so that a sailor who got familiar with using one copy could use any copy that the Navy had. And there was a highly automated factory at Portsmouth which supplied the whole Royal Navy and which relied on Maudsley and his shop for every detail of their work. Samuel Bentham, mentioned at the top of this chart, brother of the famous utilitarian philosopher. I think Sam was probably the smarter of the two, actually, was in charge of that operation at Portsmouth. The American story is parallel and well behind the British story. The Brits at the beginning in the year, let's say 1790, 1800, 1810, the technology available in Britain was almost across the board superior to what was available in North America. And that's part of how colonialism is planned to work. Indeed, the colonial economy was for the home country to do the high value added manufacturing, and the rubes on the other side of the ocean to grow the plants and distill cheap rum and stuff like that. This is the hero of my story in all three lectures is Hamilton, whom I regard as head and shoulders above the rest of the founders. He was not as good a politician. He was, truth to tell, a bad politician. Is that your judgment, Ian? An inept politician. And he had hideous judgment about intimate relations with women. Otherwise, but he was something right at a genius. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury and set about to catch up with the Brits. And there are two ways of catching up with a superior economy. One is to invent stuff, and a quicker method is to steal stuff. And Hamilton stole stuff, or induced others to steal, not physical objects, but the plan and design of physical objects. The machine, the Arkwright water frame, which doesn't look like much to my 21st century eyes, was the central mechanism in producing cheap cotton cloth on a massive scale, powered by water, and powered by water even 100 years after the first steam engine, which is another story about technologies actually get absorbed into real life quite slowly. And a general purpose technology like a steam engine took, on average, about a century to become working in routine ways. Hamilton worked with a guy named Tench Coxe, who was his deputy in Treasury, And the federal government wasn't a big thing in the first round, right? There were about 12 employees total in the Department of the Treasury. And Hamilton did most of his work for himself without delegating to others. But he delegated to Cox the task of capturing British trade secrets related to textile manufacturing. And Samuel Slater, shown on the right, many decades after the story we're telling, after he had emigrated to America and become the founder of Slater Mills, which were an extremely important Rhode Island company, manufacturing cotton cloth using technology which he stole by working directly for Arkwright under the indirect supervision of the Secretary of the Treasury. This is a 1978 photo of one of the mills that was part of the Slater Mills operation in Waltham. We're working on machine tools and textile manufacturing and so on in contemplation of an economy based on steam engines. But we're not using steam engines. They are expensive and relatively unreliable compared to water flowing through a river. And that made river towns, how many of you have been through or visited the town Windsor, Vermont? Anybody who goes very far into Vermont has to pass, I think it's exit 8 on I-91, which is, there's a sign that says Windsor, birthplace of Vermont. But it doesn't mention Robbins and Lawrence machine tool factory. It's now called an armory. MIT actually took over the preservation of it and manages, it's a little museum. I went there last summer 3 times, full of early 19th century machinery of a very high caliber. And Robbins and Lawrence was influential throughout northeastern United States, as we'll see in just a second. Here's a chart. Robbins and Lawrence is at about 9 p.m. on the clock face there to the left. And they're located in Windsor because it is a river town on the Connecticut River. And they had constructed a canal which created a sluiceway, which made it feasible for Robbins and Lawrence to conduct quite heavy manufacturing in that seemingly isolated location. Mastering these charts is not part of our object, but it is worth looking at the arrows. The arrows represent influence typically when a given artisan moved from one firm to another, or when a firm licensed a design to another firm. These charts were all done by Joseph W. Rowe, who was a junior faculty member in the Yale Sheffield Scientific School and published in 1915. And it's a beautiful piece of sociological and technological research. Eli Whitney, of course, was located here in New Haven. We will hear more about him momentarily. Smith & Wesson became a world important manufacturer of high quality weaponry. Winchester Repeating Arms at its peak, located just west of the Yale campus, at its peak employed 26,000 people. Think about 26,000 full-time equivalents. The campus, well, Sam, you ran that campus as Science Park after they left, was something like a little city unto itself. And all these connections are linked back in ways that Rowe and others can trace out to the very early perfection of machine tools which made possible everything they did. Surplus slides, my fault. Interchangeability, that's what these bolts and nuts are for. The so-called American system is that I can't put two bolts together. I pick one bolt and one nut. I can be perfectly sure that any nut will fit any bolt within the same size framework and the same thread pitch. And that's a huge element in the wealth of any industrial society today, is widespread interchangeability of machine parts. The question of who perfected that and how it got to be the so-called American system is quite interesting. It was invented by somebody named Bloch, B-L-O-C, in France. Somebody just push the button. When Jefferson was in Paris, he went to an exhibition where where LeBlanc invited people to at random pick parts of a gun lock out of bins and put them together. And Jefferson was blown away by the fact that he could, as he put it, at hazard, pick part A and part B and fit them together, and by golly, they worked exactly right. And so Jefferson writes home to, I think, John Jay, saying, this is something we've got to figure out how to copy. Some writers, including Rowe of Yale Sheffield, think that Whitney perfected interchangeability. Others, notably Simon Winchester, say dreadful things about Eli Whitney. And there is a little evidence. Bill Brown, anybody in the room know Bill Brown? Yeah, we have lots of people. He knows more about today's topic certainly than I do, and runs the Eli Whitney Museum quite brilliantly. And when I asked him about this, he said, well, there are file marks all over the Whitney gun locks. And the file marks aren't there because the things fit interchangeably. So there's probably a degree of truth in what Winchester says. That's enough of interchangeability. I could talk about the Enfield rifle, but
at least you should choose an American one, not an English one. That's an English one.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's English, but made with American machine tools. This was at the time of the Civil War. American machine tools were being shipped all over the world because they were the best and most precise available. Now a very different story. This one involves learning too, and a fair degree of chicanery. And it begins, as I hint in the slide, it begins in the Yale chemistry department with a young Dartmouth graduate having been given a vial of crude oil by a professor at Dartmouth. And the guy who had it, Bissett was his last name, was thinking that there might be some money to be made in oil, and was interested in finding out where, if there is money to be made, he could acquire quite a lot of it. And he brought his specimen to Benjamin Silliman, Jr., for whom Silliman College and a great many other things around Yale are named. And Silliman wrote an elaborate report. The original is in the Beinecke Library to this day. What he did was prescient. He distilled the crude oil using a device like the one pictured on the left here, to find the fractional components of it, which would boil off at different temperatures. And he told the young man from Dartmouth that he was onto something, that there were powerful opportunities here. He focused mainly on combustibles that could be used as fuel, in particular kerosene and naphtha, which in the case of Standard Oil were the pivotal products that made Standard Oil what it became. The fractionating tower of a modern oil refinery is a big apparatus, almost perfectly analogous to the laboratory device that Silliman used. In 1850, in the late 1850s, they hired the gentleman pictured here, Edwin Drake. They hired him here in New Haven, matter of fact. Edwin Drake was an unemployed railway conductor. And his principal qualification for the job was in western Pennsylvania, where they had come to suspect there was something called Oil Creek, and they had come to suspect that there might be oil nearby. And they sent this guy out there to drill a hole and see if there was. And the reason they chose him, they were short of capital, and they, as an unemployed railway conductor, he had a railway pass, which would allow him to reach western Pennsylvania free of charge. And so they picked him on that basis, and they were lucky. He was pretty ingenious and persistent, and he drilled a hole. It kept collapsing, and he figured out how to use a metal pipe as casement to prevent it falling in on itself, and indeed did strike oil near Titusville, Pennsylvania, which I've never seen. Has anybody here ever been to Titusville? Wow. Is it an exciting place? Okay. So the initial story is the initial challenge. The oil came in pretty good quantity. They're producing 3,000 or 4,000 barrels. Each barrel is 42 gallons per day. And the question was what to do with it, how to get it to some market. And barrels were the first answer. You can see a huge barrel yard in the background there. And tankage, the round thing lower right, was a temporary solution, very temporary. And the key players in this early story were Teamsters. Teamsters running ordinary wagons pulled by horses. And the Teamsters quickly figured out that they had a really good piece of leverage with which to extract high prices for hauling the oil to the nearest railhead. You can read that as well as I can. The interesting part is $1 per barrel mile as a charge would be killer. No way that could be sustained. Flatboats on Oil Creek, of course, were part of the workaround. But the real workaround was a pipeline, a 2.5-inch diameter pipeline, which is described here at some length. The Teamsters tore up the first version of it, as you could imagine they might. And an armed guard was ultimately required to protect the thing, moving oil 80 barrels an hour across 2.5 miles to the nearest railhead. Oil production and consumption accelerates very quickly in the years after the Civil War, as suggested here, with about 10 million barrels by 1873. And indeed, by 1873, Standard Oil was already a company and a suddenly very important company. I've already pretty much said what that slide says. John D. Rockefeller and the rise of Standard Oil is the remainder of the story. The vertical for petroleum, a vertical meaning the set of processes from the beginning when it is in the ground and nobody knows where to find it, to the point where it is in a container and we can pour it into a lamp and use the kerosene to illuminate a room. So you read the chart bottom to top, and Rockefeller stationed himself in Cleveland, right in the middle of this vertical, at the point of refining the oil. So he starts with crude oil and ends up with kerosene, naphtha, and other products, replicating on a vast scale the tiny operation which Professor Silliman had carried out decades earlier at Yale. Rockefeller his father was a crook and a bigamist, two complete families operating unbeknownst to one another. And Rockefeller, there was a certain cunning about John D. Rockefeller. And he looked at this story and said, where is the leverage? And thinking back to the Teamsters at Titusville, saw that it was in transportation. And so his scheme involved collaborating with people operating railroads to gain a huge and utterly unfair advantage over his competitors. This is the chessboard around 1870. The oil country, the triangle at the west is the oil country in Pennsylvania, Cleveland in Ohio on the edge of the Great Lake, the shore of the Great Lakes, and Pittsburgh, not very far away. And then the eastern parts of the board are New York, New Jersey on the one hand, and Philadelphia on the other. Rockefeller seized on the two transit vectors shown in green here, and allied himself with the railroads to create an advantage which would cripple, literally cripple, if not destroy, anyone who was shipping oil at full fare on the same railroads. Yeah. The railroads are in frantic competition, and they need long trains full of paying cargo. People are fine, but the real money is in freight, and the idea of a freight train with 100 cargo cars of oil was the perfect thing from the point of view of the railroads. Well, this is the guy. Next slide. Young man Rockefeller starts out at age 16 in Cleveland without a job, becomes an accountant, and actually a very capable one. And his ability to calculate costs very, very shrewdly was a big part of his eventual story. He and an Englishman named M.B. Clark started a commission business on the docks in Cleveland where they dealt in fresh produce. And within 2 years, they were grossing $450,000, which was a lot of money. A lot more money than it sounds like. Would be calculated well into the tens of millions in today's dollars. He then partners up with this guy, Andrews, in an oil refinery. There are 25 competitors in the same part of Cleveland because it's a perfect shipping point toward the west and from the oil country. And John D. is the shrewdest, the toughest, and the most aggressive among them. Yes, slide. Standard Oil was formed in January of 1870. That's the whole contract in hand script on the screen. But Standard Oil was pretty much one of 26 Cleveland refineries until you began to tamper with the shipping rates. And John D. engineered the creation of the South Improvement Company. Some people try to clean it up and say Southern, but it's not Southern, it's South. It was a shell company. The charter had been approved by the Pennsylvania Railroad for an entirely different purpose, but Tom Scott was in on the deal and was the political boss of Pennsylvania at the time, and helped John D. to repurpose that charter to create an alliance with several railroads, as indicated in the slide. A feature, and he put not himself, but a loyal henchman in charge of the South Improvement. And one provision of it was that the waybills for all shipments of oil on any of these railroads from any producer or consumer would pass through the desk of this henchman of Rockefeller's, so that Rockefeller could chart what everybody was doing or trying to do in his business with one data set. It's a remarkable edge to have. Now, drawbacks and rebates. Rebates there was a nominal price, and the law would say that a common carrier, a railroad that is open for business to everyone, has to have a posted rate and charge the same rate to everyone. And the drawbacks and the rebates were ways around that. The rebate meant I pay you the full price and then you give me a kickback, reducing the effective price in the ways, I won't repeat the math on the board. A drawback is a nastier item even than that. A drawback means if you're in the deal with the South Improvement Company, and you ship oil for another company not included in the South, then you will pay me a fee for every barrel of that oil you carry. So as they carry more of the competitor's oil, more dollars are transferred to the Southern Improvement Company and thence to Standard Oil. Yeah. His pitch to the 25 competitors in Cleveland was pretty simple. He was the only member of the South Improvement. He went to all of them and said, feel free to compete if you think you can do it. And they would all know they couldn't do it. And he said, well, I will welcome you to join Standard Oil by selling your plant to me. I'll have an appraiser come around and we will offer you a price. And the price will be what we estimate you could make using that plant on your own against our impossible competition. And sure enough, they all sold. Not quite all. There were a few who just stuck it out to the bitter end and died with their boots on. But he became a monopolist on Cleveland refining and wasn't content with that. He, of course, wanted to be a monopolist nationally. We don't have time to follow that story out to the end. There are wonderful books about Standard Oil. The tipping point is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which had the purpose, its primary purpose, was to try to curtail Standard Oil's near monopoly on the national market. It had no such effect in the first 15 years after 1890, but a lawsuit was filed in 1907. The Justice Department actually filed it, and it was United States versus Standard Oil. It was decided ultimately at the Supreme Court in 1911. William Howard Taft, another Yale-connected person, was important in the narrative, and they broke Standard Oil into 34 companies. And the effect on Rockefeller, would you think devastating? No, it made him actually quite a lot richer because the split up companies were more efficient in what they did than the big company had been. And he never lacked for pelf again in his life. The stories get shorter and the slides fewer as we go. Fear not. I don't want to stand between you and a drink upstairs. Henry Ford was a scoundrel, a very clever scoundrel, and an interesting man. When I call him a scoundrel because of his vicious anti-Semitism. He was way off the charts. He was well beyond the ordinary garden variety anti-Semitism of his time. He was also really good at organizing production. And the Model T, which was, I think, his 8th or 9th attempt at manufacturing an automobile, begins in 1908 and creates the first instance of mass affluence in the American economy. I'll show you why. First, this is an interesting fact. Ford didn't have secrets. Ford didn't generally use patents. He invited journalists and engineers from other companies to come to his plant and look at everything and write about it as they chose. My source in working on this was a journal called American Mechanic, which we have in Sterling Library from the period. And every few months in the years after 1908, there's an elaborate story on how Ford makes a brake cylinder or a magneto or whatever else. And so he was not hoarding knowledge. And it eventually came back to bite him because Alfred Sloan and others at General Motors were able to use the information edge they had about Ford to their own advantage, copying the best stuff and leaving the rest to Ford. This is learning by doing. And it sounds a little smug because it is. He says, I knew how to build a car, and I built it. And the Model T was quite remarkable. He built 15 million of them, and they changed the face of American life. In almost every respect, not every respect, for the better. This was a highly regimented assembly line where the car is actually a 6-story plan. The car starts on the top floor and works its way down like this until it's ready to be shipped out. I have beautiful slides about the plant, but we don't have time. Here's what's remarkable about Ford. On January, well, let me tell the story better. In 1908, the workforce hates the Ford plant. They hate their jobs. They hate them for a good reason. Have any of you seen the movie Modern Times, where you have to keep up with the assembly line, where Charlie Chaplin is going like this? It was that. It was brutal. And turnover was on the order of 50% a year of workers just quitting. I'm not going to do this. And Ford was then paying about $2.50 a day. And on the 1st of January, 1914, he announced a $5 wage, the $5 workday. It outraged everybody else in the manufacturing trades. The effect was to give him enormously privileged access to whatever workers he wanted. And he had done the math and knew that it worked. The chart here, if you look at the right-hand column, how many days do I have to work at the Ford plant to accumulate the retail price of the product? And that starts out, I'm sorry, not the right-hand column, the second from the right-hand column. Wage days needed to buy a Model T. Starts out well over 300 days, a solid year of effort, and ends up under 2 months. So the real pay level is improved to a staggering degree. And it's two things happening at once. One is that the price of the car is falling from $850 down to $310, and the wage level is going up from 2 and change to 6. And a third thing is that the labor content of the cars is getting less and less and less. the plant is more and more efficient in the use of labor. So they start at over 157 days. I have 157 as the number for 1912, so all I can do is guess what 1908 would have been. But my guess is it was probably close to 200 days. And they get that down to about 50 man days per automobile, which is pretty high by modern standards, but was extremely low then. The effect was to empower working people to buy products which had, in the very recent past, been entirely unavailable to the likes of factory workers. And that is a signal contribution to the wealth of this nation. Now we're going to look at what an hour's work will buy in some standard commodities. These are computations rigorously and carefully carried out by our student, Peter Luff, who is hand operating the automated slide machine. This is the wage cost in time of a dozen eggs. In 1900, we're at about a day of work, an hour of work, sorry. An hour of work to buy a dozen eggs. And by the present time, we are down to a very few minutes. Can you give it a number, Peter? A negligible interval. Now beef is different. Beef gets to be fairly cheap by 1900, but there is no systematic downward trend in beef prices over the 20th century. Yeah. Coal, a big bump in the 20s and rapid decline during the Depression, and it's been pretty flat since the Nixon era, I would say. Yeah. Sugar, Havemeyer Sugar Trust notwithstanding, gets to be pretty cheap. It gets to be pretty cheap, though the retail price of sugar in the United States is way above world prices, and that's due to the Havemeyers. It's really cheap compared to the American past, but not really cheap compared to the present in the rest of the world. Aluminum is a great story. Before 1886, aluminum was a precious metal, comparable to gold or platinum in value. And two people at once, one of them an undergraduate at Oberlin College named Hall, invented a way of using electrolysis with electrical current to extract aluminum from bauxite. And the price began to fall and has fallen ever since. About 10 days ago, I checked the London Metal Exchange, and a metric ton, which is about 2,200 pounds, was selling for $1,700 and change. And you can, well, we do. We make, well, that soda can I have on the desk there is probably about 1.5 cents worth of aluminum. It's a very cheap product today. American capitalist inequality in income and net worth. I'm not going to talk long about this, and I don't have the answers. One answer is there's a hell of a lot of inequality. Yeah, let's put up a curve. This curve was devised empirically by Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian engineer, polymath, and economist. The horizontal scale measures income from none to off the charts. And the vertical scale represents the number of people at each income level. It is an asymmetric curve with a long tail on the right, that is the high end, and a short tail, if any, on the bottom or left-hand side. The median household, this is the median, splits the distribution into two equal-sized groups. So there are roughly a majority on each side of the yellow bar. And the mean is well to the right of the median. Why? Because of the big numbers on the right-hand tail, the big numbers which pull the mean up. Okay, the quick interpretation of this is that a majority of Americans have an income below the national average. It's somewhere in the high 50%, maybe 58, 59% of American households have less than the average income. And that's an annoying political fact, right? I mean, that's awkward. And it's true of every capitalist country. Taxes can modify it, and we may be about to modify it, but it is a pretty stubbornly repeated distribution story about market economies. If we had time, we could go through 50 countries and do the empirics, and they would all look more or less like this chart. The bottom half. The current political debate is about to be focused on this book, just published a few days ago, called The Triumph of Injustice: How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay, by two French economists who teach at Berkeley. And I'll give you their numbers in just a second. Well, let's do their numbers. Here we are. They say the way to think about the country is having four classes: the rich, the upper middle class, the middle class, and the working class. Most of the fight is about the working class. And their estimate is that the mean, not median, mean income of people in the lower half of the American income distribution is $18,500 per worker. So if you have two workers, it's $37,000. If you have one worker, it's $18,500. I think $18,500 is probably wrong. I think it's probably wrong by $8,000 or $10,000, which is a lot, but it's still a pretty small number. And the fight, which is now playing out in the Democratic primaries, is focused mainly on that bottom half. And our government is not well set up for responding to that. And my own take goes something like this. There are things that I call merit goods that I think everybody has a right to have. One is nutritious food. Another is decent health care, not concierge health care, but health care. And another is decent shelter. And I think it is the government's business to make sure that everybody near the bottom of the income distribution has civilized access to those merit goods. One way to do it is with transfer payments, hand people cash and say, go find it. Another is with, for example, food stamps and similar programs. The food side of this, the fact that about 10% of Americans are food insecure, is a disgrace. This is the most productive agricultural economy the world has ever known. And it is beyond embarrassing that there are people, well, I tell the story of having visited a New Haven household, this is some time ago, where it was a 4-generation household with 13 members. And the great-grandmother, the matriarch of the household, the owner of the place, had a chain wrapped around the refrigerator and through the handle, and slept at night with the chain around her, with the key to the refrigerator around her neck. And I think that's not okay. I'm a big believer in capitalism and a big believer in the market freedoms that make it so inventive. One last, oh, here we go. Well, the first point I've already made, and the great wealth of a capitalist republic like ours is in the practical knowledge that has been generated in the 10 generations up to now, and will be generated in the next 10 generations going forward, God willing. Is the American Republic ideally suited to deal with the problems we face? No, not even close. We are a long way from well-equipped to deal with the fundamental decisions that are implicit in the facts I've been reviewing. Is it well worth our valuable time to explore further? I think so. In fact, I think so with some passion. What the founders got right, what Alexander Hamilton most of all got right, was the idea that perpetual learning is the core value of a free society. And our own is an imperfect embodiment of that ambition, but it's a pretty robust and healthy and resilient version of it, in which I think we can quite properly rejoice. Thanks very much, and we're ready for drinks. Thanks.
Thank you.